So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah! The NFL Draft is right around the corner. In just 2 days' time, Brad Holmes and the Detroit Lions will be forced to make a decision that could impact the future of this franchise forever. Now, over the last couple of months, we have talked a ton about different draft strategies that Brad Holmes may have, as well as different paths that he may go to lead this team forward. He could take an offensive lineman first. He could take a wide receiver. He could take a cornerback or an edge rusher or a defensive player or an offensive player. Heck, he might even take a special teams player for all we know and keep us on our toes. But we've yet to really talk about Brad Holmes' past. We've yet to really take a look at the last three classes that Brad Holmes has put together and how he has been constructing this roster so far, and really try to put together a true drafting strategy for the Detroit Lions. So today, that is exactly what we are going to be doing with the draft strategy of Brad Holmes for the 2024 class. Now, taking a look at Brad Holmes in the past, Brad Holmes really has 5 pillars to drafting for the Detroit Lions. First off, and most important for Brad Holmes, you have to be the best player available. It doesn't necessarily matter what position you play at. It doesn't necessarily matter if it's the biggest need on the board. If it is any kind of a need for this team and you are the best player available, Brad Holmes is more than likely going to take you at any spot he sees fit. And if he thinks that you are a good value at that position, there's a good chance that you are on the Detroit Lions radar. We already touched on this, but positional value, really not that important to Brad Holmes. Obviously, last year took a big swing early, taking Jahmyr Gibbs with the 12th overall pick and Jack Campbell with the 18th overall pick, and then doubling down in the second round with Sam Laporta as the 34th overall pick. He opened up his draft class, and even you could argue Brian Branch is a slot cornerback with his first 4 picks in the top 50 being the 4 least valuable positions on the football field, and positions that typically go on days 2, 3, and even an undrafted free agency. He took in rounds 1 and 2 because he saw that they were the best player available. He saw that they were the best fits. He saw that they were the best players available, and he decided to take those guys. Last year is a prime example of it, but even going back further, you have guys like Penei Sewell at the 7th overall pick, despite wide receiver being a bigger need. You have Aleem McNeil in the 3rd round, despite already addressing the defensive line position in 2022. He drafts the best player available because those players are typically the most talented, and even if it's not your biggest need, they are going to have more impact than a player that you reach for because of positional value. Brad Holmes loves athletes. If you look at all 3 draft classes over the last 3 off seasons, just about everybody has a green RAS score. Now, every once in a while, there is an outlier. I remember a couple of years ago, I believe it was Malcolm Rodriguez, maybe, that wasn't the best athlete, or one of the players had a relatively subpar athletic score when it came to the combine testing and the numbers. But for the most part, I would say about 95% of the time, you are going to be a really good athlete to be on this team. And if you're not, there is a very, very particular circumstance to go with that. Brad Holmes likes football players. Brad Holmes likes athletes. He likes the best player available. And typically, Brad Holmes is a big fan, especially early, of taking guys from big programs and programs that win football games, and typically programs that put a lot of talent into the NFL. You look at who Brad Holmes has drafted from the most over the last couple of seasons. Alabama has 3 picks in the top 50. Iowa has 2 picks in the top 50, obviously both from last year. Tennessee, a big-time program 2 seasons ago, had a big quarterback prospect that they took. Michigan was the Big Ten championship. They took Aiden Hutchinson from Michigan in the 1st round. Kentucky, not the biggest football program, but they were a really solid SEC program. They took Josh Paschal, right? You have guys from Oregon like Penei Sewell, who had a great season and a great career at a big program. Guys out of Washington, guys out of NC State, right? Big Power 5 conferences that are winning 10, 12 games a season. Amon-Ra St. Brown out of USC, right? Big programs that put out big time players at big time positions are typically where Brad Holmes likes to draft and typically how he likes to address these players. Now, I know positional value isn't the biggest need for the Detroit Lions, right? I know it's not the biggest thing in the Brad Holmes arsenal, but the Lions obviously do have needs that are bigger than others. And going into this year, I think they have 4 primary needs and 3 kind of sub needs that would be very helpful, but aren't necessarily going to be the biggest priorities day one. Cornerback, I think, is the biggest one. You lost Cam Sutton this offseason, even though you brought back Emmanuel Mosey, even though you traded for Carlton Davis, even though you brought in Amik Robertson, the secondary is, I would still say, average at best. I think Carlton Davis is a really good cornerback. I think he will be a good cornerback one for the Detroit Lions. If Emmanuel Mosey is healthy, I think they could be a really good above average cornerback duo. And I think Amik Robertson has some traits that the Lions really like as well. But realistically, that is a pretty thin cornerback room at this point, especially with the departure of Cam Sutton. The Lions need a cornerback. They have about 3 guys right now that can start on the boundary. And after that, you're taking a look back at Kendall Vilder and Khalil Dorsey as your starting cornerbacks, which is not something you really want to have, right? We were taking a look even before the Cam Sutton news broke that we needed a cornerback to play on the boundary opposite of Carlton Davis. And I think that need became even more apparent when Cam Sutton left. And I think that they might draft 1, if not even 2 cornerbacks in this class, potentially ones very, very early. The defensive line is also important. Edge rushers, pass rushers, and defensive line are the staple of Brad Holmes. His first draft class, 2 of his top 3 picks were defensive linemen. The other one was an offensive line. His first pick in 2022 was a pass rusher. His third pick in 2022 was a pass rusher, right? He took a pass rusher in the 3rd round this past season. Every single year, Brad Holmes takes defensive line. Every single year, Brad Holmes takes players from the trenches because he knows that trench players build great football teams. So again, I wouldn't be surprised if defensive and offensive line were very early off the board because again, you go back through the classes in 2021, Penei Sewell, Levi Onwuzurike, Aleem McNeil were your top 3 picks. You go to 2022, Hayden Hutchinson was your 2nd overall pick. Josh Pascal was your 2nd round pick. Malcolm Rodriguez and James Houston was a 6th round pick, again, a pass rusher. You go to this past season, you have Broderick Martin in the 3rd round, who is a pass rusher. And even though he's not a pass rusher, Jack Campbell is a member of that front 7. So Brad Holmes loves the front 7. He loves the trenches on both offensive and defensive sides of the ball. And he needs players that can play that position well, especially considering the offensive line quality that the Lions have had over the last few seasons, but also the ages of the offensive linemen currently on the roster. And then wide receiver, I think, is another big position. With the departure of Josh Reynolds, they really need a 3rd wide receiver. Josh Reynolds was the clutch guy. Josh Reynolds was the underdog. Josh Reynolds was the guy that didn't get covered by the top receiver or by the top cornerback because the Lions had Amon-Ra St. Brown to work underneath, because they had Jameson Williams to stretch the field, which allowed Josh Reynolds to work the intermediate field, work the middle of the field, and get a lot of big receptions, a lot of big catches. And for most of the season, he was the Lions wide receiver too. He's now in Denver. Donovan Peoples-Jones very well could step up, but you also have the opportunity in a historically good draft class to draft a great wide receiver prospect potentially on day 2. And then, of course, you have safety, tight end, and running back players in positions that I think would be good to add some depth at and good to add some talent. But if they don't walk out with these positions, I don't think it's going to be the end of the world necessarily. So with that being said, this is how I see the Detroit Lions going round by round. In round 1, I think it's really simple. I think you take the best defensive playmaker that you possibly can. Looking at this draft as of right now, it is very top heavy on the offensive side of the ball. This is a draft class where you are going to see 3, 4, maybe even 5 quarterbacks go before the 29th overall pick. You're going to see 4, 5, maybe 6 wide receivers go. You're going to see potentially up to 7 offensive linemen go. And I think there's a real possibility that 20 of the top 29 picks are going to be offensive players. And even if you put that up to 10, even if you put that up to about a third of the players in the first round being defensive, which is still a crazy number, you are still guaranteed one of Teron Arnold, Quinyon Mitchell, Dallas Turner, Jared Verse, Leatu Latu, Johnny Newton, Byron Murphy, Kool-Aid McKinstry, Nate Wiggins, Cooper DeJean, or Chop Robinson. That is 11 players. So even if 10 defensive players go in the top 29, which I don't think is going to happen, you will still have the opportunity to get one of these defensive playmakers. The numbers make sense, and the numbers tell you that there will be a defensive player available for the Detroit Lions. There will be a defensive playmaker and a stud at that 29th overall pick. And because of that, I think the value is going to be on defense, and Brad Holmes is going to take a defensive player, whether it's a cornerback, whether it is a defensive lineman, whether it is even potentially a safety like Cooper DeJean. There is a great chance that the first player off the board is on the defensive side of the ball, and they will figure out the rest of it based off of this pick. But I would guarantee the 29th overall pick is one of these 11 players. Now, moving into round 2, I think this is where the Lions go and get an offensive weapon. I think they shift back to the offensive side of the ball and particularly target the wide receiver position, right? If you look at this position over really comparing it to the last couple of years, this is a historically good draft class. PFF has, I believe, 17 pass catchers graded in the top 70 of this draft class, including obviously Brock Bowers, who is a tight end, but is a great pass catcher. I have Marvin Harrison, Malik Neighbors, Roma Dunze, Adonai Mitchell, Brian Thomas, Troy Franklin. You have Lad McConkey. You have Keon Coleman. You have Roman Wilson. You have Ricky Pearsall. You have Xavier Worthy. You have Xavier Legette. You have Jalen Polk. You have Malachi Corley, all of whom ranking PFF's top 70 players in this class. That is 15, I believe 16 wide receivers, including Brock Bowers, that will potentially go in the first 2 rounds, which means a wide receiver would have to be taken every 5 picks for them not to be one of those wide receivers on the board in the second round at the 61st overall pick, where the Detroit Lions select second overall. One of those wide receivers is going to be there. And I think the wide receiver depth in this wide receiving group is going to push some of those guys down the field, because you're going to be on the clock in the first round and you're going to say, okay, we could potentially have Adonai Mitchell or Brian Thomas here at 15, or we could wait until the second round and we could get Ricky Pearsall. We could get Xavier Legette. We could get Xavier Worthy, potentially Keon Coleman in the second round, which is maybe not necessarily the better player, but potentially the better value, pushing wide receivers down the board, meaning on day 2, when there's more wide receivers on the board, all of those guys that are good enough to go on day 2, your Xavier Legettes, your Xavier Worthys, your Ricky Pearsalls, your Jalen Polks, your Malachi Corleys, they're all going to fall later into the second round than they should, because of all the depth and the abundance at the position this year, meaning the sweet spot for wide receiver, the sweet spot for that offensive weapon is going to be in the second round. And I think it's going to be where the Lions attack it the most, either getting, I think their top priorities would be either Xavier Legette or Ricky Pearsall, the wide receiver from the University of Florida. I think both of them would fit the Lions offense really, really well. And assuming they're there at 61, I think it's an absolute no-brainer. Moving on to the third round of the NFL draft, I think there's a good chance that this is where the Lions go out and they get their offensive line. This is where they get their trench player, right? Yes, the Lions' offensive line is elite. It is arguably the best offensive line in football over the last 2 years and will likely be so this coming season after adding Kevin Zeitler to the right guard position. But looking at it for a long-term future, there are a ton of questions on this line. Taylor Decker's going into the last year of his contract. Kevin Zeitler is 33. Graham Glasgow was 31 on a 3-year contract. And Frank Ragnow had suspicions of retiring this offseason. And this very well could be his last season playing in the NFL, meaning the interior of the offensive line especially is going to be a massive need. And in the third round, again, much like wide receiver, this is usually the sweet spot for that guard position, right? This is going to be for your Cooper Bebe, I believe is how you say it, from Kansas State, your McCormicks, your Van Prans, your Moonies, your Mahoganies, your Pauls, your Bordolinis, the center from Washington. This is where you get your interior offensive linemen of the future. Players that might not even play day 1 will probably be the 6th offensive lineman. Maybe you put them in as a swing tackle just because they're that athletic and they can do so. And then in year 2, you have them starting. You plug and play for Kevin Zeitler. You plug and play for Frank Ragnow. You plug and play potentially for Taylor Decker in 2 to 3 seasons. And I do think over the next 2 draft classes, the Lions are going to have to look pretty heavily into boosting up this offensive line, because the offensive line is old. Two of the players, both of their guards are over 31, and Frank Ragnow very well could be playing his last year of professional football, meaning the entirety of your interior line is probably going to be different by the 2026 season, which is just 2 years away. Drafting an offensive lineman in the third is probably the smartest thing the Lions can do. If they go in the first, if all of those defensive players, for whatever reason, are off the board, there's a good chance that Jackson Powers Johnson or Zach Frazier will be there, which I think would be a great option as well. But offensive line in round 3, Zach Zinner's another one you could put on here. It seems like the sweet spot. It seems like where you could get really good players for really good values because unfortunately guard and center are just truly that undervalued. I think Brad Holmes is going to look straight through that. He's going to take a guy in the third, and he is going to probably upset a lot of people going offense 2 of your first 3 picks. But I think down the road, a lot of people are going to appreciate it. And then in the 5th round, because the Lions do not have a 4th round pick, I think they go kicker. I think Brad Holmes shakes up the NFL draft a little bit. Again, ruffles some feathers, makes some people mad, but I think they select Joshua Carty potentially as early as the 5th round in the NFL draft. As I am making this video, as we speak, the Detroit Lions are at the Stanford Pro Day watching just Joshua Carty, the only Stanford player that is, I believe, eligible and expected to be drafted. They are at the pro day right now, watching him kick, meeting with him, talking with him, and they very clearly do have some kind of interest in the kicker from Stanford. Joshua Carty has an 85% field goal percentage in his career, a 98.6 extra point make percentage in his career with a long of 61. He is one of the best kicker in this draft, and I think he would be a great kicking prospect for the Detroit Lions. Finally shore up that kicking spot. Make sure you give Michael Badgley some competition. Maybe you bring in the kid from the Michigan Panthers. You have a 3-way kicking competition between a great college prospect, an NFL veteran, and a player in the USFL that is killing it right now and is arguably looking better than most of the kickers in the NFL at this point. I think Brad Holmes is going to address the kicking position earlier than a lot of people think, and I do believe that it will be Joshua Carty, the kicker from Stanford, but I also think it could be the Bama kicker as well, just depending on who they like more and who they think would fit a little bit better with the team. And then as we get down to the 6th and 7th round, the Lions have 3 picks in this range at 201, 205, and 249. This is where Brad Holmes looks for the special teamers. Brad Holmes in the past has very typically gone with special teams contributors on day 3, right? Guys like Antoine Green, who was a big special teams guy last year. Guys like Chase Lucas, who was a special teams ace. James Houston and Malcolm Rodriguez both started on special teams on day 3, being 6th and 7th round picks. Jamar Jefferson was a special teams player. Derek Barnes, even as high as the 4th round, was a special teams guy. This is where the Detroit Lions are going to find their Chase Lucas replacements. It's where they're going to find their special teams aces and potentially some guys that can work, right? So potentially some role-playing guys like James Houston, like Malcolm Rodriguez, like Antoine Green, who I think could have a bigger role in the offense this year. Day 3 is typically where Brad Holmes has his sleepers. Brad Holmes has the guys that he really likes. So it's really hard to project what guys those are going to be, but every single player drafted on day 3, every single player in the 6th and 7th round of the Detroit Lions draft classes over the last 3 years has had some kind of special teams benefit and some kind of special teams attribute that they can put on the field. And these are some of the players that I think bring exactly that. Quantez Stiggers from the CFL, a player the Lions have brought in on a top 30 visit, very well could be a 7th round pick for them, being a special teams guy early, as well as potentially finding a role in the slot as a backup to Brian Branch. Anthony Gold, the wide receiver from Oregon State University, has a little bit of Amon-Ra St. Brown to his game, only 5'8", but runs a 4.39 40-yard dash, met again as a top 30 visit to the Detroit Lions this time around. And he, I think, is another player, very much like Antoine Green last year, that could have some special teams value as a kick and punt returner, have some value as a wide receiving field stretcher, and just be a player that the Lions like to have around. Khalif Raymond is going into the last year of his contract, I believe, so he could be the potential Khalif Raymond replacement as a kick and punt returner for the future. Josh Proctor, the safety from Ohio State, I think has great special teams versatility, as does Troy Taylor, the safety from Air Force. Steel Chambers, I think, has some good special teams value. And then there is, I'm blanking on his name. Let me just check real quick. Jalen Carly's, I believe is how you say it, the safety from Missouri, also a really strong tackler, put up good tackling numbers. I think would be a great special teams player as well for the Detroit Lions, and really just some guys to, look at, guys that could potentially be role players, guys that could potentially have some future roles. A lot of special teams versatility is huge on day 3 of the draft, and I think every single one of those guys will be contributors at some point on their team on the special teams before transitioning to the actual offensive or defensive side of the ball. With all of that being said, that is my 2024 draft strategy for the Detroit Lions. That is the strategy I believe the Detroit Lions will take. That is the strategy that Brad Holmes has shown to kind of work with in the past, and that kind of fits the parameters of what he has done in the past. However, with that being said, take this with a grain of salt, because Brad Holmes, if anything, the most predictable thing we can say about Brad Holmes is that he is unpredictable. Last year, we all thought, yeah, he would never take a running back in the first round. He would never take a linebacker in the first round. He loves the trenches. He loves the wide receivers, the defensive ends, the offensive linemen, the defensive linemen. And he went out and he drafted arguably the 4 least valuable positions in the first 4 picks last year. So with that being said, we don't know where Brad Holmes' head's going to be at. We don't know if he's going to draft a quarterback in the first round. We don't know if he's going to draft a linebacker in the first round again, a safety in the first round for all we know. But based off what he's done in the past, based off of team needs, based off of value at the picks, that is how I see the Detroit Lions draft class going. I'm not going to put out particular names with particular picks here, but as we went through, obviously you saw the options at each and every individual pick. So with all of that being said, let me know how you feel about it. Let me know how you think about this draft strategy. What do you think is going to change? What do you think draft strategy is going to be? If you disagree with my list, put down a little bit of what you think is going to happen in the comments. Be very curious what you guys have to say. But with all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so very much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.